You're listening to Retail Disrupted, a podcast that explores the latest industry developments and the trends that will shape how we shop in the future. I'm your host, Natalie Berg. Hello and welcome back to Retail Disrupted. I am so excited about today's guest, but before I introduce him, I want to spend a few minutes to talk about Amazon. Earlier this month, Amazon celebrated its 30th anniversary. It's hard to imagine a time when we didn't have Amazon. It's hard to imagine that we actually had to walk into a bricks and mortar store when we wanted to buy anything. And it's also hard to imagine a time when we weren't so ubiquitously connected. So I have been very busy over the past couple of weeks doing lots of media. I've been on TV and radio talking about Amazon and everything that they've achieved over the past 3 decades. I've talked about how they've revolutionized the way that we shop. They've democratized e-commerce. And in the process, they've been a real catalyst for change. And if you look specifically at online shopping, all the things that we take for granted today, all the things that just seem like normal, commonplace, basic hygiene when we're doing our online shopping, a lot of these things were Amazon innovations, the marketplace model, fast and free delivery, user-generated ratings and reviews, one-click checkout, and all the work that's happening to reduce friction at the checkout, both in-store and online. Again, Amazon was the catalyst. So I think it's fascinating, and that's why Maya Knights and I wrote our book on Amazon, because it's just been so fascinating as an observer to watch this ripple effect on the entire industry. And something that Maya and I always say is that when we try to sum up why Amazon has been so successful and how they've managed to weave themselves into the fabric of our everyday lives, there's so much to unpack here. And I should say, we are going to do a separate episode. I'm going to get Maya on the podcast in the next couple of weeks before I take a break for August. So stay tuned for that. We are going to dive into this in a lot more detail. But just a couple of things here before we come on to today's episode. First thing we have to remember is that they have a relentless dissatisfaction with the status quo. Now, if you listen to my podcast regularly, you'll have heard me say that before. But I think that line just really sums up what has made them so successful and what really differentiates them from their peers. Now, also, long-term thinking, the luxury of long-term thinking and having deep pockets and the fact that they are a technology company and not really a retailer. All of these things play a part. 2 more points I want to make around Amazon. One is a quote that I want to share with you from Jeff Bezos. This was a quote from a few years ago, and he said, bearing in mind this is Amazon's 30th anniversary, he said that if you look at large companies, their lifespans tend to be 30 plus years, not 100 plus years. So with the context being Amazon has just turned 30, it does make you wonder how they will continue to evolve in the future, whether they have what it takes to stay relevant, because things are moving very quickly. We know that the Chinese disruptors, the Temus, the Sheins of the world, even TikTok, which again is becoming incredibly commercially minded, these are genuine threats to Amazon's business. And there's lots more to explore about how technology and AI are helping to level the playing field, about how physical stores today are being repurposed and retailers are doing a fantastic job. Legacy high street retailers doing a fantastic job leveraging their stores as digital assets. But also this broader move towards immersive digital commerce, which again is something that I feel very passionately about, that is very much the direction of travel. So I'm not going to say any more for now. Stay tuned for my episode with Maya. We're going to unpack this in more detail and get her views from a tech perspective. And I will also include a link in the show notes to one of my radio interviews. This one was Radio New Zealand, first time doing that. So that was very exciting. And what was especially enjoyable about this interview is that we had a long time. So it's just over 15 minutes long. which is a lot longer than I normally get. But it was great because we could really dive into all of the topics and just go a little bit deeper than I can normally do. So I'm going to include a link. Check the show notes if you're interested in that. And as I said, stay tuned for my episode with Maya. Now, on the last episode of Retail Disrupted, I spoke to David Blakeney, who is the former store development director at House of Fraser and Souk. David and I spoke at length about department store reinvention, and that is very much a theme that is going to continue on today's episode. We're going to be hearing from Steve Dennis, who is a strategic advisor, keynote speaker, podcast host, and best-selling author of Remarkable Retail. He has a new book out called Leaders Leap: Transforming Your Company at the Speed of Disruption. Now, I know many of you already know Steve, or you are at least familiar with his work, but let me tell you a little bit more about him. Steve is a top global retail influencer. His thoughts on the future of shopping are regularly shared in his role as a Forbes Senior Contributor, as well as through other media like CNN, The Wall Street Journal, and Bloomberg. Steve is a sought-out keynote speaker. He regularly delivers talks on 6 continents, sharing his unique perspective on what it takes to reignite customer growth in a world of unrelenting change and shifting customer preferences. Steve is president of SageBerry Consulting, where he has advised dozens of brands on their growth strategies. Prior to founding SageBerry, Steve was Chief Strategy Officer and SVP Multichannel Marketing at the Neiman Marcus Group. He serves on multiple boards, both for-profit and nonprofit, and he holds an MBA from the Harvard Business School and a BA in economics from Tufts University. One last thing about Steve before I welcome him onto the show. He has an awesome retail podcast that he co-hosts with Michael LeBlanc. Like his book, it's called Remarkable Retail, and it really is a must-listen. He speaks to both U.S. and global retail leaders, and some of his recent guests have included the CEO of Crate & Barrel, Chief Digital Officer at JD Sports, and the Chairman of IKEA. So I would absolutely encourage all of my listeners to make sure that you're also subscribed to Remarkable Retail. Okay, you've heard enough from me now. I think it's time to welcome Steve to the podcast. Steve, welcome to the podcast.
Well, thanks for having me. It's great to be with you.
No, it's great to have you here. I know we're passionate about a lot of the same topics, embracing disruption, reinvention of the physical store, the role that tech plays in enhancing the customer experience, and really all the big trends and innovations that are reshaping our industry. So it's a pleasure to have you here today and to have the opportunity to connect. We're going to touch on a lot of the topics I just mentioned, but first, let's talk about your new book. It's called Leaders Leap: Transforming Your Company at the Speed of Disruption. Now,
Right.
this isn't your first book, so I'd love to know what inspired you to write it and what are you hoping readers will take away from it?
Sure. Well, I guess what inspired me to write it is for years I've been coming back to this question, not necessarily phrased this way the entire time, which is something along the lines of if the world has changed so much, why have you, either the leader or the brand, changed so little? Having worked in this space for quite some time, starting my career at Sears, which I'm sure many of your listeners would know was once the biggest retailer on the planet and has basically gone away at this point. I've had a lot of time to observe companies that fail to adapt to what's been going on in the world. And so it's been a curiosity of mine as kind of an intellectual subject, but also I kind of deal with it firsthand, working with clients and so forth. So when I wrote my first book, Remarkable Retail, I somewhat touched on the need to transform at a faster pace and to transform more radically. But over the last several years, I've just been kind of digging into it more and decided that I would take a crack at trying to understand why companies don't do the things that they must and see if I could bring a unique perspective to it. So I guess I should mention it's not exclusively a retail book. So one of the other things I wanted to do was kind of spread my wings a little bit and try to take on leadership more broadly and leverage my retail experience, but not focus on that exclusively.
Yeah, because I guess a lot of the learnings can be applied to other industries as well. It's such a time of disruption and change that a lot of businesses are having to transform for this digital era. Now,
Hmm.
in your book, you say how leaders have fundamentally misunderstood risk, that slow and steady does not win the race, and
Right.
actually that playing it safe is the riskiest strategy of all. And I totally agree with that. I've said time and time again that standing still is the most dangerous thing you can do. Again, not just in retail, but in any business. So I'd love to get your thoughts on this, Steve. I mean, would think that after a pandemic and after all of the tech disruption that we've witnessed in recent years, you'd think that everyone would be adopting a more agile way of working, right? But, we're
You
still
would think
seeing some
so.
really big brands, like, Body Shop, I think, is a great example here. We're seeing really big brands that just aren't keeping up with the customer and they're paying the ultimate price for it. So, why do you think that is? Why are brands getting stuck?
Well, I think there are a couple things going on. I mean, there's definitely an aspect where, and I try to touch on this a little bit in the book, where people haven't really done the homework, or they're not paying enough attention to what's going on with consumer trends, competitive trends, impact of technology. So sometimes there really is a fundamental lack of awareness and acceptance. But what I try to do in this book, and what I hope is different and useful compared to some other, I would say more academic strategy kind of books, is really look at leadership behaviors and mindsets. So not make it so much about, well, here is the strategy that is guaranteed to win, or here's how to think about, blue ocean strategy, or some of these kinds of concepts, but actually see how, as leaders, we're often our own worst enemy. And I think that often circles back to how our ego gets in the way. It circles back to, as you were saying, a fundamental misunderstanding of risk, and really how fear can keep us stuck. So I try to, with these 7 leadership mind leaps I talk about in the book, I try to really get at more of these attitudes and behaviors, and a little less about the strategy itself. Because I think in most cases, definitely my own experience way back when at Sears and some other jobs I've had, we often knew what to do. We just didn't do it. And so that's a lot of what I try to explore in the book.
That's so interesting. I just had James Keys on the podcast. He's the former
Hmm.
CEO of 7-Eleven and Blockbuster. And he was actually telling me it was fear, not Netflix, it was fear that killed Blockbuster. It's so interesting
Right.
hearing what he said, what he had to say about the business. And he's very passionate about, business transformation. And something else that he really drilled home during our conversation was this belief that CEO shouldn't stand for chief executive officer, but change equals opportunity. And I
Hmm.
love that. His view is
Yeah.
just that change is the essence of all commerce, and that the most important skill for any leader is the ability and the openness to continue to learn, to continue to adapt throughout your career. So I wonder what you make of this, Steve. Would you agree with James in that retail leaders or business leaders more generally should be prioritizing this idea of continual evolution?
Oh, I agree. And but what I've tried to, and I should say, but because I don't, it's not in opposition to what he's saying. I think one of the questions is, well, because if you look at the statistics, and I quote a few of these in the book, most CEOs, and this book isn't just for CEOs, but I guess to try to think about who's most responsible for strategy and change at an organization, we can kind of put it into the senior leaders' purview remit. uh, most CEOs say they need to transform, they need to disrupt their organizations, they need to adapt, they need to understand technology better. Like there's both McKinsey and Alex partner studies that I include in the book. I recently saw a similar study for Bain. So there's plenty of data that says that CEOs understand that change must be a priority. And also, if you look at what's going on at many companies, you'll see that transformation and innovation is talked about a lot. Many companies have created either an office of transformation or a chief transformation officer. So there's plenty of understanding and declarations about it. But I think we have to get back to, what is it that keeps folks from making the changes they need to, even if they agree. It's kind of like this is maybe not the best example, but it's kind of like the way I would approach getting in shape and dieting. Like, I know that I need to eat better. I know that I should get more exercise, right? And I know that if I don't do that, the chances that I could, particularly as I get older, have negative health outcomes, it's pretty clear, right? Pretty much everybody knows that.
Mm,
Yet we often don't do. And I think that gets to our relationship um, to risk, the way we think about it. And I think it also gets to some other things that tend to keep us stuck when we more or less know what we need to do.
yeah, that's a really interesting point. Now, I want to ask you about failure because in your book, you write that as a leader, you're going to fail and that's okay. And my view is that as an industry, our perception of failure is evolving because simply because you don't have the choice anymore. You have to try new things. You have to keep moving and keep experimenting. And the reality is that most of these ideas won't work. But of course, the alternative is not doing anything. So,
Exactly.
um, right. So, one of Jeff Bezos's leadership principles, which I love, is exactly this. It's this idea that failure and innovation are inseparable twins. And I'd love to get your take on this. Can you tell us a little bit more about the benefits that failure can bring to the table?
Well, I think there are a few things going on here. First of all, I think it's next to impossible, at least in many cases, to kind of analyze your way into a really robust solution. We see so many breakthrough technologies or new business models that start out in one place and end up in a very different place. And so I think part of the way you learn is to put, whether you want to call it a prototype or proof of concept or whatever, but put more ideas out into the market to get response from customers, to learn about just operationally how well positioned you are to execute things. So I think it used to be like when I started my career, you do all this analysis and then you'd have this kind of ta-da, here's our big idea out in the world. But of course, that was a very, very different world. So I think today, just as a practical
Mm,
matter, it's too hard to just kind of study your way to a perfect answer. I think you put out things, learn, iterate, pivot, uh, and then, in some cases, learn to fail fast and move on to the next thing. So I think that's the nature of the way change happens today. I also think that fundamentally, you have for most businesses, probably not all, but for most businesses, you have to take more of a portfolio approach as well. So even companies that I think are pretty good, I'm working with a company now that I would say has a pretty good aptitude or attitude towards failure and has developed some good skills. But they put, not to use too many tired cliches, they put all their eggs into one basket. And so hopefully the few things that they're working on and are willing to fail at will pan out. But again, I think you just need to have a lot of irons in the fire in many cases and work through them very, very quickly. That it's more about trying more stuff and developing the mindset to let go of things that aren't working quickly, take the
hmm
learnings from things that work kind of a little bit and apply them. So I think this has been pretty well known, but for a while, like there's a bunch of stuff that I say in the chapter on that's fundamentally about failing fast is a culture of experimentation more broadly that I think are things that people have heard and even repeat sometimes, but don't often do very well. So I'm sort of really fascinated with this knowing doing gap that seems to be characteristic of lots of organizations.
Yeah, yeah, there is that disparity, isn't there? And that kind of goodwill or that intention to transform or intention to kind of let go and maybe fail fast. But the reality of actually doing it must be pretty scary for a lot of businesses. Now, one thing you caution in the book is that it shouldn't take a crisis to motivate for
Hmm.
change. Now, we certainly saw this during the pandemic where, retailers were acting very quickly, launching things like scan and go and click and collect in a matter of weeks or
Right.
in Walmart's case, they rolled out curbside pickup in 6 days. So I love that
Yeah.
stat.
Yeah.
But it's this whole idea that, necessity is the mother of invention. And, that definitely rang true during the pandemic. But why do you think, looking outside the pandemic, because I like to think that was, hopefully a once in a lifetime kind of event. But, outside of COVID, why do you think so many business leaders end up waiting for a crisis to take action?
Yeah, this is, I'm glad you brought that up. It's one of my pet peeves. Actually, in my first book, I probably took an overly cynical approach to this topic because I said rather than kind of this high fiving that was going around the industry of like, look how fast we stood up, whatever, click and collect. I'm like, well, if I were on the board, I would be in the face of those managers to say, well, if this was a good idea, why didn't you do it 3 years ago? I'm
Yeah.
particularly sensitive to click and collect because I happen to work for two retailers that rolled out click and collect over a decade ago and saw the power of it. So just to me, I've just been fascinated by a few things that have like, well, when are you going to do it? And I did
Yeah.
actually have a client that I was encouraging to roll it out, and they were slow walking it for a couple of years, and then they rolled it out in 2 weeks when COVID hit. So, but I think it just it kind of circles back to the relationship to risk. When you're facing down or in the midst of such a crisis as COVID, and you're just trying to keep the lights on, basically, suddenly your risk perception, risk analysis really flips. I think the question is, how do you create the urgency in what is really a slow motion crisis? Like if you look at the department store industry as one of my favorite things to make fun of, or shouldn't say make fun of, but be critical of the department store industry, at least in the US, but I think it's broadly true in many other markets, has been in decline for more than 20 years. It's been really obvious where share has been leaking and migrating and why that is. And yet, the department stores, for the most part, have done almost nothing to stem the tide. And the result of this is we have seen not only folks like Sears go out of business, but we have seen the major players close many, many hundreds of stores and go through endless rounds of cost cutting. And none of this has stemmed the tide at all. And so, why is there not more urgency to take more bold action? Because it's pretty clear most of these retailers are on the road to extinction. But I think it
Mm,
gets to how we think about risk. Very slow, painful death apparently is more preferable to taking some more significant risks. But it's not an all or nothing. Getting back to kind of the failure topic, it's not an all or nothing proposition. Anytime along this last 20, 25 years, these retailers could have been piloting very different business formats because it's clear the business design is fundamentally broken. So they need a new business model or perhaps multiple business models. But really, none of them have tested anything significant. They've chosen to do much more incremental mental things, kind of faster horse strategy when you really need a totally new mode of transportation. So I think it's easy for me to point at these problems. I realize it's not so easy to actually do them. But what I try to do in the book is be a bit provocative with retailers or leaders, I should say, to take a look in the mirror and see. The first mind leap I talk about is this idea of crushing your ego, because I think ego is the enemy in a lot of cases. It's certainly been when I've gotten myself into various uh, problems and troubles. It's been my problem where I think I have all the answers, or I keep using the same set of things that have made me successful in the past and expecting that they are going to generate strong results in the future. And I think what we've seen time and time again is that what's gotten many retailers to the pinnacles of success has not necessarily served them well in a very, very different world. And in fact, trying to go back to that same set of skills and assets actually may get in the way of retailers making the changes they must. So I think we have to take a really hard look at how our confirmation bias, how we lean on the same set of skills, how we're unwilling to be vulnerable many times to ask for the help we need or be open to different people's perspectives. I mean, there's a lot in that, and certainly it depends on the particular culture, the particular part of the industry. I often say, your mileage may vary. There's not a one size fits all solution to brands that find themselves struggling, but I think there are some themes, some through
yeah.
lines to what needs to be done.
And this might sound like an obvious sort of follow-up question, but to what extent should brands really be listening to their customers? Because I know all retailers like to think of themselves as being customer centric, but
Yeah.
it's kind of like it goes back to your point about, knowing that you need to transform, but actually and knowing the risks of not doing it, but actually going ahead and getting that started is a really hard thing. And I just think it's really interesting, at least here in Europe, what we're seeing is more and more businesses actually bringing customers into management meetings. We're seeing more head office staff walk the aisles. That's becoming a
Mhm.
prerequisite for a lot of head office staff here in Europe. And so it does feel like there's this recognition that there's no such thing as ivory towers anymore, and you really do need to bring the customer. Start with the customer and then kind of work backwards, as Amazon has always done so well. So yeah, what are your thoughts on customer centricity?
Well, it's funny you mentioned this. This has become like a little side project of mine in the last few months because, um, I've heard various leaders, to your point, talk about, our new strategy is we're going to be customer focused or something like that. And I'm kind of like, well, what have you been doing all this time? Like, it really is. And I'm not trying to just be cute about it, but it's, it's quite remarkable to me that, first of all, a well-educated, well-experienced person would say something like that in public, because probably should be followed by "I resign," because it's just not acceptable to not be customer centric, and also to say, I've worked with one client that says they're very customer centric, but in fact they're very customer service focused, which is great, but is not the same as being
Yeah.
customer centric. I mean, you have to be um, driven by a deep understanding of the customer and have ways to put that knowledge into practice. So it's curious to me that this is a thing that we've gotten to this point. Having had customer insight and analytics report to me at a couple of companies, this has been so much of what a good chunk of my nearly 40-year career has been about that I have a hard time seeing straight when I hear people talk about this. But I can say for sure that if you have a good workable customer segmentation and that you are paying attention to why you are not acquiring as many customers as you need to, or why you're not growing the share of wallet or frequency or basket size, whatever, how various measures of growth, if you are not retaining those customers at the rate you need to, and if they are not sharing the story of your brand in a way that is going to bring you new customers or cement the loyalty, then you don't have the foundation to drive your strategy. And nor will you discover where there is a leaky bucket in your customer base. So I think it's very, very foundational. I have kind of taken it for granted for the last few years that most retailers are doing this, and then I have discovered that many are not. And so, if you are not customer centric, I would suggest you try to become customer centric as soon as possible, and you pay attention to what that really means. But yeah, it is. It is. I mean, I think it's definitely part of the explanation for why there hasn't been more urgency at some retailers that are struggling because they don't think they have the analytic base and understanding of the drivers to the degree. Because if they did, presumably they would be addressing them more aggressively.
Yeah, and I guess it is a huge cultural shift for those retailers that aren't that it should be, but aren't customer centric right now. And I guess another important component here is the role of the employee, the role of the store associate.
Sure.
And there's this whole idea that actually you don't want to be customer first, you want to be employee first. Because if your employees are happy, they're going to provide that experience and that service that will drive customers and to come back to the store and drive loyalty. And I know Neiman Marcus is a fantastic example of a retailer that's always really put the customer first. So yeah, what are your thoughts around that, Steve, around the employee and the role that they play in driving customer satisfaction?
Well, I think it's absolutely very important. So I wouldn't push back against that idea. I guess I'd say it's kind of necessary but not sufficient for a couple of reasons. One is, it's not enough to have. I mean, it can be very important, but it's not enough to have your sales associates or your frontline service people be driving it. One, because so many customer journeys start in a digital channel that your ability to capture customer interest, engage, and drive customers to your website or to a store often has very little to do directly anyway with a human being. Now, once they show up in the store, for sure, that can be hugely, hugely important and a big differentiator. But things like product assortment and design, and there's other things that aren't directly related to store associate performance that can be hugely important. But I think you should pay a lot of attention to that if you're in a business that's more face to face or has a lot of engagement between human to human. I think many
Hmm.
times we underestimate the value of that emotional. I'm using the term emotional connection a little bit loosely, but we're social creatures. We our right brains and left brains coexist in a lot of decision making. So having that high touch environment, relating to a human being, having someone who could not only show empathy but have a skill level that helps us make a better decision. I mean, all of those things can be hugely important, particularly in the more upscale luxury types of products. So I think that that's very big,
Hmm.
and I think sometimes when we get focused on, I mean, as much as I'm super interested in the impact of technology and digital disruption and all this kind of stuff, I think we can often lose sight of how important human beings and face-to-face interactions, or they could be interactions at a distance, but where you're talking or interacting with an actual human being, that can be hugely important. And I think sometimes because of all the technology, we lose sight of that and kind of get on the efficiency side of the equation more than the effectiveness side.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I think, to your point around not just the human connection, the emotional connection, as you said, but also sometimes it is just problem solving, like, ordering
Hmm.
something that might not be in stock or, being able to pay on the spot. So I think sometimes it's just cutting those small points of friction that can really elevate the experience. But then sometimes it is about going beyond and offering that more personalized service, again, augmented through the use of technology. So
Hmm.
it's when you kind of marry the human touch with the tech that you have a really powerful combo, and something that I know you and I both talk about a lot in our
Yeah,
in our
and
day jobs.
and just one more point. Sorry to interrupt, but maybe one more point on that. I think this is actually a really good example of where the lack of being customer centric can cause companies to lose sight of things. Because one of the things I've seen with a bunch of clients and also studying some companies is that if you go back, I don't know, 10, 15, 20 years, where almost all retail was done in a physical store, and where the physical store really had a lot to do. The customer journey was basically about getting the customer to get on the bus or the train or whatever, get in their car and come to our
Mhm.
store, sort of driving that driveway decision. Um, then you would spend a lot of time and energy in terms of conversion on what that in-store experience was like, and therefore that often led you to, I mean, obviously you have the product in stock and attractively presented and all that kind of stuff, but a lot of times, particularly on the higher end, put a lot of pressure on that sales associate and how well that transpired. If you're paying attention though over time as to how customer journeys are changing, you would see that lots of, as I think most of us know by now, most customer journeys for most categories start in a digital channel. And what that often means, particularly in kind of high touch or high service environments, is that customers come into the store, even if they still want to transact in a physical store, they've started in a digital channel, but they've often done a lot of research online. So they come in with a much more focused set of questions. And in some cases, they may actually be more knowledgeable about a particular product or service than the sales associate. So if you spent all your time kind of holding on to the traditional sales associate to customer relationship, you've missed a lot about what today's sales associate needs to be able to do to really add value in the customer relationship. And you may also not have invested enough in technology to support that sales associate. So, because so many times I work with one client where, we kept seeing that our customers were coming in more knowledgeable than a lot of the sales associates. And it wasn't because the sales associates got worse. It was just because we had so many products that it was impossible for the sales associate to be as knowledgeable a given customer that's gone down one particular, exploration of a TV or something that hadn't, checked all the reviews online and checked all the pricing. And, it's just an enormous amount of information to try to keep track of. So I think
Mm.
if you were doing the work you needed to understand how customer journeys are changing and how that needs to be reflected in the in-store experience, you would have invested in different training, different support tools, technology, et cetera.
Yeah. Yeah, you're right. Because as customers today, we are hyper informed. And as you say, we are often more informed than the store associate. And I guess the big risk for the retailer is that, a customer comes in having done all that research, as you've just explained. If they don't find what they want, or they can't find the product, or they don't have the right support, from a member of staff, well, then, they either walk out the door or maybe even buy that product on Amazon while they're in the store. That's the risk, isn't
Hmm.
it? So
Sure.
yeah, it's just managing all that. I want to stick with the theme of bricks and mortar, and actually, I want to go back to something you mentioned earlier because I know you do have very strong views on department stores. So, you said earlier that
I'm
you
so
said
shy.
earlier
I'm so shy about that.
we love strong views on a podcast. You said earlier that too many department stores. I'm sorry, I can't remember your exact phrase, but you basically made the point that they weren't doing enough and they weren't going far enough, just kind of taking baby steps. So, what what would you recommend? What needs to happen? Do we have too many stores? Do we have to? Is that an uncomfortable truth? And what does kind of the future of physical retail or the future of department stores look like to you?
Well, I think broadly speaking, in apparel, most markets are have too much capacity chasing too little demand. So from that perspective, I would say it's hard for many players, that particularly the ones that are only slightly better than average, to earn good returns because there's just too much capacity. So I do think we need to have some further store closings, and I suspect we will continue to see that. The one of the issues with store closings, like a lot of times when people say, well, so and so retailer needs to close stores, that is often true, but it is usually because of years of bad management and having become irrelevant. So the one thing I often say is the only thing I know about closing stores is you've done nothing to make your business more customer relevant. You've basically taken a store away from a customer. And if they like shopping in a physical store and you've closed that location, you've basically given them a reason to go somewhere else, because it is rarely true that these retailers that are closing all these stores are so powerful that the customer is going to travel further, and in many cases travel past all the stores they've often been shifting some of their spending to over the years. So store closings, there's very few examples. In fact, I can't think of any consequence where a struggling retailer has store closed or cost cut their way to a turnaround. It's usually the beginning of the end.
Mm.
So when we get to the situation, and this is where unfortunately I can't be super optimistic, and it's one of the things I talk about in the beginning of my book, Leaders Leap, is that this transformation gap can occur where you have a long history of not providing enough relevance and differentiation, that you fall further and further behind. And then you get to a point where the chasm is too big to cross, both from a kind of intellectual standpoint, like can you even come up with a strategy that is likely to win back the kind of market share that you've hemorrhaged? But as a practical matter, you have investors, and companies have investors, whether you're public or not. Can you possibly finance uh, such a bold strategy? So the lesson there is don't let it happen to you. Don't get to that point. So with department stores, particularly in the U.S., I think many of them have no chance of turning themselves around because there's nothing at this point that is financeable, if that's a word, um, to mount their turnaround. But what should have happened 10 or 15 years ago, as we saw so much of the market share migrate off and away from the regional malls to off-price retailers and specialty retailers, they needed to either, and it's probably both, make their mall-based stores much more powerful draws. And the problem in department stores, fundamentally, aside from just some of the challenges in malls over the years, is that they sell a little bit of everything to everybody. and not much of
Mm,
anything to anybody. And so business has been migrating downwards, so to speak, to more value-based retailers, whether that's, the Walmarts or off-price retailers and the like here in the US, Ulta in the beauty business, Sephora, those sort of retailers, or people have been trading up, the more affluent customers have been going either to specialty stores that offer something, really built for them and more special. So this getting stuck in this, what I call the unremarkable middle, is really difficult. So if you're going to drive people to the malls, you have to become special enough and be like the other tenants in the mall that are doing well, the Lululemons, et cetera. Or you have to take your powerful businesses and bring them closer to the customer. Now, you can do that online, obviously, which many of them have. But, in the US in particular, a lot of the department stores are just outstored by many of these more value oriented concepts. So, trying to make the choice to drive all the way to the mall, to park in the big parking lot, go up the escalators, walk through, 150,000, 200,000 square foot store, when you are driving past two or three much more focused stores, much more easy to access with generally lower prices. Like, very few people are going to actively make that trade-off, and we see that in the results. So it's difficult. I mean, you basically had a business model that started to run out of gas 20 years ago, and they needed to basically blow it up and reinvent it over a period of time. But as I said, they've mostly just tried to make what they have a little bit better, and it's just not enough.
yeah, yeah. Those marginal improvements just aren't enough to kind of save the concept. And I think, to your point around other retailers doing it better or doing it in a more convenient way. It's those mediocre retailers, it's those stuck in the middle, those that aren't evolving. Those are the ones that I think are most at risk. So really interesting stuff. One last question for you, Steve. I have to
Sure.
ask you about drones because I know you're based in Dallas and Texas seems to be a hotbed for drone delivery trials.
Right.
So, Walmart is offering its drone delivery service for up to 75% of the Dallas Fort Worth population. Texas is also one of only two states where Amazon is actively offering drone deliveries. It's relevant for our European listeners because this year Amazon is bringing drones to the UK and to Italy. So, Steve, what do you make of these drone wars? Do you think it'll become an accepted and viable way of delivering stuff in the future?
Well, one answer is I hope not. I guess I view this a little bit like allowing cell phone conversations on airplanes, that I think that at a certain level, it just becomes super annoying. But I do think that in certain areas, for certain products where both the physics of it and the costs and some of the friction that it eliminates, I think it will get some sort of adoption. I can say, being here in Dallas, I have yet to see a single drone delivery. So it can't have too wide an adoption, or at least they're not flying them close to where I live or where I happen to drive. But
Yeah, that's
I
good
think
news
we'll
for you.
continue. Yeah, I think we'll continue to see experimentation. I think we'll see a limited level of it, but I just don't see that many communities are going to want to deal with all these drones buzzing around all the time. It just seems like there's a and I can't translate that to percent of deliveries or anything like that. I suppose if I sat down and tried to play around with some math, I might be able to do that. So I think we'll see wider adoption. I think just given, the realities of the costliness of delivery and the war for speed and all those kinds of things, it will spread in certain areas, but I don't see it being kind of a massive shift in the way that products get delivered.
Yeah, just another piece of the puzzle, I suppose.
It would be great. Having I worked in the appliance business for many, many years, and the cost of delivery was a major thing, and also just the logistics of delivering a refrigerator or dishwasher or whatever it might be were pretty challenging. But of course, there's limitations on what drones, the weight of and size. So
You need a
some of the best
helicopter.
applications, yeah, some of the best applications don't lend themselves to at least the current physical limitations of drones.
Steve, we could literally be here for hours. There's just so much to talk about. And I know we're both so passionate about retail. I really appreciate you coming on the show. I will include a link to your book in the show notes for any listeners that would like to purchase the book. And I wish you all the best with your book launch.
Thank you. I appreciate it. And Thanks for having me on. I look forward to seeing you in real life one of these days.
Thank you for listening to Retail Disrupted. If you enjoyed this episode and would like to support the podcast, please leave a rating or review or share it with others. It really makes a difference.